I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts. You have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Adam Finnegan. Be sure and check out my films. Occult Louisiana is on Tubi, Roku, Apple, and a few more. Doors of Perception is on Amazon Prime and free on Relay. We are booking guests for April. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Also, if you'd like to make a donation for our film fundraiser, we have links right in the description. Any donation of $100 or more, and you get a film credit as well as a pre-release copy of the third film. Today I want to welcome Adam Finnegan. He is a survivor of Lyme disease and immune tolerance. He has been battling health problems from a very young age. He is a writer, graphic artist, and designer. He is also an avid reader and researcher of history, biological warfare, esoteric philosophy, spirituality, and the Western mystery traditions. Adam, welcome. How you doing?
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you, man. Really looking forward to this. We're going to discuss your investigation into the possibility that Lyme disease and potentially even HIV originated from Cold War era bioweapons research. You're also a survivor of Lyme disease, and you've been battling health problems from a young age because of that, which led to your pursuit. You have such essential information that you've been looking into, and I'm sure my audience is thoroughly going to enjoy this. Before we get into it, though, this is your first time on. Tell us a little bit about yourself and let the audience know how they can find out more.
Okay, yeah, sure. My name's Adam Finnegan. I got involved. So this is my book. It's called The Sleeper Agent: The Rise of Lyme Disease. Rise of Lyme Disease, Chronic Illness, and the Great Imitator Antigen to Biological Warfare. I got into this after getting sick myself. Well, my mother was sick, and then I got sick many years later. And I had read all about this in a book called Lab 257 about Plum Island, right? And that was the first book that really brought Eric Traub's name out into the open, the scientist that was brought over for in Operation Paperclip. And so I had read that book, and it was just really interesting to me. And for whatever reason, when I got sick and realized that I had Lyme disease, something just kind of activated. I was like, I want to figure out this story. I ended up going really deep into it, finding out a lot. I ended up getting involved. I started talking to someone named John Loftus, who held the who held a very high security clearance, the highest you can get in government, and he wrote a book in 1982 called The Belarus Secret that talked about the biological warfare experiments that Lyme disease was connected to. And so I reached out to him. And I showed him some timeline that I had constructed, and he thought it was great. And then I started corresponding with him. He also introduced me to another high level biodefense source. And I was kind of able to get some hints at what to look into. And there was a memo that the biodefense guy had written for Loftus. And I remember I read that, and that was kind of like the basis of everything I was looking into. So after that, it just kind of took off.
Your book, The Sleeper Agent, maybe you could give us a brief synopsis before we break everything down.
Yeah, so I would say essentially it's about the stealth biological weapons of biological warfare, which, unlike highly fatal bioweapons, which there are those too, but this is focused on ones that tire, exhaust, and overwhelm an enemy slowly and with stealth. It's a long-term strategy, and it's far more effective in the long term. You still get fatalities. It's just they're more indirect. Things like cancer, neurological diseases, and it's very slow. So it's like a slow death rather than a quick one.
Mm.
And very hard to diagnose and treat. And by the time, so the idea is by the time the enemy figures it out, it's already basically too late. Um, Very sinister weapons, and this guy Eric Traub, who it largely centers around this guy Eric Traub, but it also goes into the Soviet biological weapons race too, because it was basically a global thing. I also go into early British biological warfare where they were using smallpox. I have George Washington quoted on the British using smallpox as a weapon in 1775, I believe it
Mm.
was. And so I also go through like the Irish famine being potentially biological warfare from Britain.
Interesting.
Also, there were several instances like so there was there was an outbreak of this contagious bovine pleural pneumonia in the 1850s where Britain comes over on a ship called the George Washington, gets off with a cow and says, "Oh, hey, our cow has gone dry. Our cow who we use to furnish milk for the crew has gone dry. Can we trade this cow for a fresh cow?"
Huh.
And they do, and then they sail off, but the cow they leave is infected and spreads all over the eastern seaboard
Uh,
with this. So that's like the way this game is waged. People, it's kind of like biological warfare is waged through intelligence channels like that. So it's not how most people think it is
mm.
played. Like people think of like a military operation. It's far more esoteric. It's far more plausibly deniable and things like that. They do it like that. Like the more possibility you have to say that it's an accident, the better attack it makes. But you say, hey, that wasn't, we didn't mean to do that. And it's kind
Yeah.
of like that ship sailing away. It's like we didn't know the cow was infected.
How many of our modern illnesses and diseases would you say may have possibly been manufactured as bioweapons?
Well, I mean, as far as so Eric Traub had a whole bunch of them, right? And when he came over here, I mean, it's so I would, and then there are many that are probably deliberate, but then there is also many that are probably just accidental that escaped from. Think of how much biological research we have going on. I mean,
Hmm.
somebody was calling attention the other week to me about this biolab that was uncovered. Some Chinese national or some Chinese guy with an Israeli passport. It was like a homegrown lab, and it was like a big thing. And I said, well, if you knew how many breaches of security happen in the regular labs, you'd be even more shocked
Yeah.
because it's not like it's just these homegrown labs. It's like there was this Project Sunshine thing that I had been looking into a while back that I put on the timeline that I had sent you on Loftus, and it was about all the different breaches of security and all the accidents that have happened across the nation in different biological, uh, like academic settings,
Mm.
and it would just shock the average person. So, I mean, it's shocking how much this. So, yeah, I would say to answer your question, there's probably a lot of them that are tied to this. And then with the biologic, like certain ones that are definitely weapons that have been released as weapons, there's probably a lot of them.
Talk a little bit more about Dr. Eric Traub and his involvement with bioweapons.
Yeah, so Eric Traub, he's like the center of my story pretty much. I get into him around chapter 5 and then I talk about him for the rest of the book. Lyme disease, um, and all of the co-infections that are all you get because with those ticks you don't just get Lyme disease, you get a whole bunch of different co-infections all rolled into one tick like a one of those Russian doll cocktails of disease. A doll within a doll within a doll. It's like an infection within an infection within an infection. Well, I have him with the spirochete that is closest to Lyme disease, which he got it in 1939. It was over in Germany. he also learned that same year about how to roll all of these different infections into one tick. So 1939 was a big year for that. And then all of those same co-infections he's learning about happened to show up in the black-legged tick after World War II. So we brought him over here and we basically put him at the top of the biological warfare program. He was directing all of these, what you call simulant tests. Simulant, not as in stimulant like coffee, as in simulant like simulation.
Hmm.
So the idea is to simulate a bioterror attack. So they would do these tests. One thing you could do is you could take a bacteria, you could spray it all over a city in the open air. They did that in San Francisco with a bacteria called Serratia marcescens, and it left this red pigment behind, and that was one of the ways they tracked it. But I have Eric Traub weaponizing that during the war with this virus, and then they also had these other simulant tests where they would release insects, and he would say, oh, they're just, infected with a harmless tracer bacteria. And he was at Plum Island, and they were releasing those on shorebirds. And they had this whole bird program, like this avian vector program. They released the ticks on birds, and then you'd follow the birds and see how they spread the ticks out. So he was traveling back and forth between Colombia and Central America and Plum Island. And I noticed he would always go down to Central America when the birds were flying south, and he would always come back up north when the birds were flying north. And then in the 1960s, or maybe it was the 70s, but the Smithsonian Institute was working with the military on this bird program. It was called Project Starbright. And people were like all upset because the Smithsonian was doing this. And I think it was around the time of the Vietnam War. And people were protesting the Smithsonian Institute because of this program. But it was ongoing since the days of Eric Traub. Eric Traub also ran a bioweapons lab in Germany during the Nazi regime called Insel Reims, and it's like at the very northern tip of Germany, and it's like the Plum Island of Germany. And so when they set up Plum Island in Connecticut, when he was on Plum Island, it was still under the Army Chemical Corps. Then he's like, what you want to do is you want to hide all this stuff under animal disease. You want to make it so that it seems like benign research. You want to make it seem like we're just working on veterinary problems. We're just working on animal diseases, things that are a threat to livestock. What people didn't realize, because people think, oh, animal disease, foot and mouth disease, that's boring. But what people don't realize is he was actually turning these animal diseases into human diseases, right? So people think of foot
Hmm.
and mouth disease. Well, in World War II, he had adapted foot and mouth disease to mice and made it so that it was like a central nervous system infection like polio rather than causing blisters, and it could infect humans too. Um,
Wow.
and so he was turning animal diseases to human disease. That was one of his things. So this Lyme disease, it was a bird strain of Lyme disease. All right. Once he adapted it to humans and all of the land animals, it became an entirely new disease, right? And we
Wow.
know that it's not been around a long time, even though there are all these articles that have been put out saying that they found it in mummies and stuff, and it's totally untrue. Because when you go look into those studies, they don't even know if it was even the Borrelia bacteria. They say
Hmm.
there's a 60% chance it could be Borrelia, but it could also mean many other bacteria.
Hmm.
Um, and it's just interesting because like people like me have a harder time getting diagnosed with Lyme disease than these mummies do. And that's a big
Yeah.
thing. Like, and this is one of the reasons why I started going into this because it's so hard for people to get diagnosed. And people get gaslighted by the medical industry, the healthcare professionals. It's because of the way the tests are set up. It's not really the doctor's fault, but it's kind of the doctor's fault, and that the doctors don't say something that I don't know. I mean, it's just the way the system was set up. It was designed to cover these things up.
It's most likely that many with modern Lyme disease may have contracted it from some kind of weaponized tick that was either intentionally released or maybe escaped somehow.
What I have is that it was intentionally released.
Okay.
It was these simulant tests. They were doing this. That's what my sources say. That's what
Hmm.
the evidence suggests. So these black-legged ticks, right? All the way up to 1950, all the way up to 1951, when it appears this whole thing went down, when Eric Traub was over here, they were saying the black-legged tick doesn't have any human diseases. It doesn't transmit any human diseases, right? And that was
Hmm.
one of the reasons why they chose that tick to use in those tests. Because, most of the government, they weren't trying to hurt the people. It was Eric Traub was actually working for a foreign government. And I'll get into that in a second. He was working for a foreign government to sabotage these simulant tests. And
Hmm.
so they were like, okay, this tick doesn't have any human diseases. We can use this tick and it won't hurt anybody. When he came over here, he was like, okay, I have this, we're going to infect this. It's infected with this harmless tracer bacteria. It'll leave a bullseye rash, but it's harmless. They started releasing those, but it was a bunch of infections all rolled into one. And then by 1956 is the first instance where people started getting sick. So there was somebody named Polly Murray. She wrote a book called The Widening Circle. It was like one of the first Lyme disease cases, and she talked about how she got sick in the summer of 1956. Um, and by the 60s, she's totally debilitated. Now, all the way up to 1975, then she finally got diagnosed. Or actually, I think it was like after they discovered the Lyme disease spirochete, she eventually found out she had Lyme disease, but she got sick all the way back in 1956. Then
Hmm.
I also have 1958 are the first reports of black-legged ticks transmitting serious human diseases in a newspaper article. So all of a sudden, it starts to become a thing. These black-legged ticks start to transmit human diseases. I have also the main Lyme disease researcher for the CDC, Alan Steer. He he published a paper about it, and he said all the way back to 1962 they found some of the first cases on, I forget the name of the island, but it's some island off of Cape Cod around here where I live. And they said 1962 it appears people had Lyme disease back then. So it's something that came in the 50s. Also, John Loftus talked about how they were studying it in the 50s under these multiple sclerosis tests, or these health studies on MS.
Hmm.
And I found a bunch of studies that started in the 1950s where they were finding spirochetes in MS patients. But they made it this whole controversial thing because they were trying to cover it up. The next thing I have is this very important USDA conference from 1953, and it was about biological warfare on the on the livestock and poultry industry. It was
Hmm.
a whole thing. It was a whole conference about biological warfare, and they were saying in that conference how they believed that that we were attacked with biological weapons. They say several foreign animal diseases have gained entrance into this country, and it was under the context of biological warfare. And in that conference is where they start mentioning the biological warfare agents that they think we might have been attacked with, and one of those was avian spirochetosis.
Hmm.
That is Borrelia anserina, which Borrelia burgdorferi is the closest relative to. That's where it came from. Um, and so, and then after that conference, it basically like you don't hear about it again after that. And that's because it was probably classified. That's why you had this whole blackout, because it's very unusual that Plum Island didn't do any research on it, because according to what they say we study foreign animal diseases. That was a foreign animal disease because Lyme disease infects all of the birds It infects all of the land animals. So that would have been considered a foreign animal disease. And if, Plum Island should have been all over that. And they probably were. It was just that it was classified and people didn't hear about it. Those are kind of like some of the, um, those are kind of some of the strange things that are surrounding it. I have people saying that they saw Eric Traub releasing the ticks on Plum Island in 1951.
Mm.
Um, and all of those cases, like in 1975, all of those cases, that was just like only a few miles away from Plum Island. Um, like all of the circumstantial evidence supports that this is where it came from. However, I will say that it was in Germany first. That's
Mm.
what a lot of people don't understand when they say, oh, it came from Plum Island. Yes, it came from Plum Island, but it was in Germany first. He made several other strains. So Borrelia burgdorferi, that's what they call Lyme disease. It's that spirochete, but there are other strains like Borrelia afzelii and Borrelia guarinii that are also considered Lyme disease. And those are the earlier strains of Lyme disease that he was making during the war. And then when Operation Paperclip came about, he had like made new strains. He had updated them, even he weaponized them further. That's why there's certain strains in the US that you don't find in Germany.
Mm.
Um, but so his lab, when he was doing those tests over in Germany, his lab fell under the Soviet Union. It was captured by the Soviet Union. And they basically were like interrogating all of those Nazis. Some of those Nazis decided to kill themselves when the Soviets captured the lab. There are some reports where some of them took their own lives. Eric Traub was running that lab. He was the vice president and he was directing all of the research on that.
Mm.
The Soviets were they wanted to find war criminals, right? They wanted to know, did you use the animal crematory to dispose of human bodies?
Yeah.
And it seems that they did because Insel Reams was also had forced labor there. They had the forced labor. Eric Traub and his protege, Werner Schaefer, were working on an avian slash human influenza vaccine. So they were likely testing it on human volunteers, or not volunteers, human prisoners. Uh,
Wow.
so they probably killed some people. And that's when, because a lot of, John Loftus told me that a lot of these Nazis that came over in Operation Paperclip were blackmailed by the Soviet Union. They would get something on them and they would say, okay, you either work for us or you can go to Nuremberg as a war criminal. And so they would send them over here. And British intelligence was also involved. Um, but Eric Traub, he got over to Operation Paperclip with the help of this guy, Donald McLean from British intelligence and Kim Philby, who are also in British intelligence. They are known as the Cambridge Five Spies. They defected to Moscow in the 1950s. But before that, especially Donald McLean, he got Eric Traub over here. He was a double agent for the KGB, high up in British intelligence, although I would probably say that I kind of feel like the Soviet Union itself is more or less like a puppet government from Britain.
Yeah.
Because if you study a lot of that, you'll see that it was all British intelligence was all over that, setting up the Soviet Union. So they were more or less like a puppet government. So I kind of feel like um, Britain probably knew that they were double agents the whole time, and then they just defected to Moscow in the 1950s. But we had been sharing our research with them. All of our classified research we had been sharing with Canada and Britain, right? Uh,
Mm.
it was this thing called the tripartite agreement. We also shared, I think, some of it with Australia. They were at one point brought into it. But we are sharing all of our biological warfare research. So when when Donald McLean defected to Moscow and they found a tape of him declaring his allegiance to the Soviet Union, saying he was a proselytizing communist. Well, all of Western intelligence, American intelligence, were really freaked out after that because they realized, well, he's the guy who got all these Nazis over here. So there was a guy named Dan Benjamin who was very high up in counterintelligence corps, which is Army military intelligence. Um, and John Loftus knew this guy. Well, he actually interrogated Eric Traub because when all of that went down, they started to get really suspicious of some of these guys. And Eric Traub kept turning down the top position of Plum Island. So he was turning down leading Plum Island. And they're like, why does he keep turning this down? And the reason was because when you get a position like that, you have to undergo these like extensive background checks to get the security clearance. And if you have any, if there's things like if you're working for a foreign government, it makes it, a lot of people would get nervous, right?
Yeah.
So he kept turning that position down. They're like, why does he keep turning this down? And eventually Dan Benjamin interrogates Eric Traub. And it was really interesting because it's like this is the first book that has this passage about John Loftus talking about how this went down because he knew him. Says that he kind of just made it seem like it was just an informal interview or whatever and whatever. He said he didn't use truth serums or torture for his interrogation. He just studied everything he knew about Eric Traub before he ever interviewed him. And he walked him through his story, right? That's basically what he was meeting him about. He wanted to walk him through his story, like, tell us how you got to this point and everything. He tripped him up at a couple different places. And then he said something like, do you have anything you want to say before I recommend you to be prosecuted as a spy? And he thought he was really in trouble, and he just like broke down, and he was like, he admitted it, and he was like, yeah, he said, yeah, I've been working, I came over here. I've been working for the Soviet Union because after they captured my lab, he's like, I'm just a little guy. I'm not that important. I was just trying to keep a low profile. That's why I was turning this down and everything. But he was lying when he was saying that he was just a little guy. He was probably the most important guy in the entire biological weapons race, hands down.
In your talking points, you said that he may have even been involved with the development of HIV. You also said that he was working to induce these different diseases with spiked proteins. And now we know a lot more about how the spiked proteins react with certain diseases and certain illnesses and how they cause them to activate in a sense. Was he one of the first that was experimenting with these spike proteins?
Glad you mentioned that. Yeah. So Eric Traub is actually the guy who discovered how these things work. He discovered how, because when I got sick, I actually learned about this. This is something called immune tolerance. That was the discovery that Eric Traub had discovered. And that's basically the backbone of chronic disease. And immune tolerance is, you can just think of it as chronic immune deficiency, right? They called it immune tolerance because your immune system was suppressed into a state where it would tolerate nasty, harmful pathogens it should otherwise be keeping out of your body. And when that happens, then it allows, it's just like opening the floodgates and just saying, come on in. I'm not going to fight you. Take over my house, take over this place. There's all sorts of stuff in there you can have, to a group of people. It'd be like that. Well, then it allows this central nervous system invasion into your brain and your organs. And that's when you get things like these nasty neurological diseases, mental illnesses, and cancers. So Eric Traub had discovered all this stuff with a virus called lymphocytic chorea meningitis. But what he was doing was he was injecting foreign protein into these mice. And this is, so this is when he was at the Rockefeller Institute. So he was working in America before he went back to Germany for the war. He discovered this while at the Rockefeller Institute. He's like, I want to see if I can reactivate a dormant virus from within a mouse. So what he did was he injected foreign antigens, which would be synonymous with spike proteins, into a mouse's brain, and he caused a virus to reactivate from within the mice. It was called lymphocytic choriomeningitis virus, or LCM virus, and it spread to all the other mice. So he basically started an epidemic from scratch,
Mm.
right?
Damn.
And but if you think about it, that would more or less simulate the same kind of process with injecting other foreign antigens, and we all know where that happens. But I do have him working on this other virus that is a very, very close relative to HIV. It's
Mm.
actually a horse virus, not a monkey virus.
Mm.
Although I'll tell you where the monkey stuff comes in. There's a virus called equine infectious anemia virus. It's a horse virus. It's a horse HIV, right? And he was working on this virus all throughout the war, and then in the and then when the Soviets captured Insul Reams, they started really working on that. Okay, but back up to what I was saying about this immune tolerance thing. That that horse virus also causes it, but so do these other weapons. So he realized how this works, and he basically that was the weapon. It was like this spike protein, this antigen, or on a bacteria they call them lipoproteins, lipid
Mm.
protein. They're these really toxic lipids. And that more or less was the bioweapon. And he's like, okay, all you really have to do is get this thing on all these different pathogens and you can cause this same disease. That's why you have like all of these different infections that'll cause a similar disease. Like there's a lot of people who have an indistinguishable disease to Lyme disease that got, they didn't get the tick bite and spirochetes. They got something else, and it basically all the same presentation because that's what these antigens do to your immune system.
Mm.
So when you disable the immune system with these antigens, then basically what happens is you reactivate a bunch of latent viruses that are already dormant within you. So that whole LCM virus, the viral reactivation, those early experiments, it's kind of the same thing with all of his bioweapons. It's almost like
Mm.
he was trying to do what he was doing to those mice with these bioweapons because the spirochetes they go to your brain, right? So spirochetes go to the brain, and when he has these antigens on those spirochetes, well, then it kind of delivers those antigens to your brain, and it almost simulates the LCM virus experiments. So
Mm.
the virus reactivation thing is actually a big part of the bioweapon, even though it's not actually in the bioweapon itself. You know,
Right.
it's
Right.
it's what you call a binary bioweapons too. Another thing you can do is you can infect a population with a stealth virus, a dormant virus, right? So I'm sure you've heard of SV40. Um, I don't know if you want to go into this area because I don't know if
Yeah, let's go for it. What is SV40?
okay. Well, you know about the polio vaccines being
Yeah.
contaminated? Well, that was the virus that contaminated the vaccines,
Okay.
SV40. Well, so what you can do is and this was listed in a CIA report called the Darker Bioweapons Future, where you can actually seed a population with a stealth virus and then activate it later, right?
Oh,
So you
wow.
can, because they say that half the US population was infected with this SV40. But there were also other ones. It's not confined to SV40. There were also other ones. Um, and then what you do is you activate it later, where you could have like another vaccine that is just too toxic and then activates it again, right?
Mm.
And I'll even tell you, I have it in front of me. It says, so there's a 2003 declassified CIA assessment called The Darker Bioweapons Future. It says this. It says, according to the scientists convened, other classes of unconventional pathogens that may arise over the next decade and beyond include binary biological weapons agents that only become effective when two components are combined. A particularly insidious example would be a mild pathogen that, when combined with its antidote, becomes virulent. Designer biological weapons created to be antibiotic resistant or to evade an immune response. Weaponized gene therapy vectors that affect permanent change in the victim's genetic makeup.
Wow.
A stealth virus which could lie dormant inside the victim for an extended period of time before being triggered. For an example, one panelist cited the possibility of a stealth virus attack that could cripple a large portion of people in their 40s with severe arthritis, concealing its hostile origin and leaving a country with massive health and economic problems. That has already happened. That that already happened in the Cold War. That already happened with Eric Traub and this whole SV40 thing.
So I want to go back to what you were saying about how these biological weapons diseases can be triggered at a later time. Talk a little bit more about that, and have you looked into some of the methods that they use to trigger this?
Yeah. Um, so basically, you can have like so using these animal tissues in vaccines, it's mostly about vaccines is a good way to
Mm,
re-trigger it.
gotcha.
That's why I wasn't sure if you wanted to go into this area
Yeah,
because some
man.
people.
We
Okay,
go into it all here.
definitely good. So that's like one of the main ways to both seed a population with a stealth virus and then reactivate it, right?
Hmm.
Because all you really need to do is you need to suppress the immune system after you've seeded them with that virus. And that's how these viruses reactivate. Because a lot of the chronic disease in Lyme disease is actually from these reactivated viruses like Epstein-Barr virus, human herpes virus 6, which is this encephalitis virus. Um, there's a bunch of other ones. SV40 would be among those, okay?
Mm,
So there's this nasty, it's because, see, they think that by making vaccines with the same antigen, it will bring like a healthy response. And that's why a lot of people, so I met a lot of people who got sick and had an indistinguishable disease as mine after routine vaccines of all kinds.
hmm.
You know, some people will say, "Oh, I got it from the tetanus vaccine." Some people will say Hep B, and all of those carry that nasty antigen that Eric Traub was using to weaponize his spirochetes and all the other viruses and agents that he was working on. So it matters not if you get it from a spirochete through a tick bite or if you inject it right into you, you get the same outcome. The only reason why it's variable and that not everybody gets the same outcome is because everybody has a different genetic makeup, right? There's something called HLA, which means it's human leukocyte antigen. It's just like there are variants of the immune system, just like you have different blood types. Well, there are different kinds of genetic factors that are involved in this, and that's why not everybody gets the same disease.
Mm.
That's, so this HLA susceptibility comes into play, but then there's, everybody's at a different burden. Everybody has like a different burden on their immune system. So that's the reason why, because some people say, well, I got the vaccine and I didn't notice any problems,
Yeah.
right? Well, a lot of times too, this can also happen slowly. So it may be, and it's funny because a lot of the same people who say that also start talking about how they have constant migraines, how they have joint pains and stuff like that. Well, that's all under the realm of immune tolerance. Um, but this is what you do. You have these using these animal tissues when you're making these vaccines is like they can't keep this stuff out. Like it's just impossible. I even did a little talk on it a few weeks ago called viral latency. Oh, I viral latency and reactivation. I was just kind of pulling it up here. And I talked about these mechanisms. And so when they use these animal tissues, it's like they even say it's inevitable. They can't keep this stuff out. right? They try to kind of do their best to keep it as clean as possible, but there's just absolutely no way to keep this stuff out of these vaccines because every single vaccine uses animal tissue or they use animal pathogens. Uh, like I say to some people, there's no such thing as a vegan vaccine. You can't be a vegan and get vaccines because they're all animal products.
Hmm.
Well, they seem to have this just constant problem with these viruses coming in. They call them adventitious viruses. SV40 was one of them. I mean, they couldn't even get this virus out of the vaccine after it was on the market for 5 years. Even well after they discovered it, they couldn't stop it. They still continued to have problems with it. So then when you get like, let's say, the Lyme disease vaccine that much later was just this protein. It was like just the spike protein, right? But it was synthesized. It was a synthesized version of the spike protein, or on the spirochete, it would be called a lipoprotein and outer surface protein A. Well, these things are really immunosuppressive. You can get an antibody response at first, but then your immune system just shuts down afterward. And when the immune system is disabled, that's when those viruses reactivate and start just causing problems from head to toe. So
Mm.
that would be the answer to your question that's how you do it. You bring the viruses in through those means. I mean, you could also reactivate them from like a tick bite from those spirochetes if you had that or any kind of physical stress. Even somebody who's just like really stressed out,
Yeah.
potentially could happen.
Am I correct in saying that there are certain laws that allow experimentation on the population?
Oh yeah, we can get into that too.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing because so there was a law called it was Title 50 1520, I believe. And it was a law about being able to test on the population without their knowledge or consent.
Mm.
Um, and when people found out about that, when all of those simulant, that's what allowed those simulant tests to take place. It was 15, Title 50, 1520. And then when those simulant tests became known, because like there was at least one death in San Francisco after those simulant tests
Hmm.
with Serratia marcescens bacteria, and of course there were other ones, but they were basically these laws allowed for this to happen. Then when people started to make an uproar over that, in 1997 they repealed this law, but it was very tricky. All they did was create a loophole. It was let's see. They repealed the law, but they said that that all they needed to do was, let's see if I could, okay. I'll just read what I have. In
Yeah.
1996, this law was repealed and a new law replaced the original Section 1520, which became 1520A. Restrictions on the use of human subjects for testing of chemical or biological agents. This new law made informed consent on its subjects necessary with several loopholes. The new law allowed as exceptions to the law. One, any peaceful purpose that is related to a medical, therapeutic, pharmaceutical, agricultural, industrial, or research activity. Or two, any purpose that is directly related to protection against toxic chemicals or biological weapons and agents. So that it's as long as they say that it's to protect against biological agents, or if they say that it's a research activity related to medical, therapeutic, pharmaceutical, agricultural, and or industrial, then they can do it. Because it's like, oh, we're repealing this law, but we have this exceptions clause that basically strikes out the whole repealing the law as long as we say we're just doing it for your good, for your protection. We're just doing
Yeah.
it for your protection.
That's absolutely insane, man. Let's talk a little bit about what's happened since 2020 with the experimental inoculations that were forced under the guise of this COVID operation.
Yeah.
Many believe that not only is there very detrimental ingredients within the vaccines, but there may be some sort of technology. The mRNA technology may be much more in depth and have much more detrimental applications than most people know of.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak for the whole nanotechnology,
Right.
uh, but I can say that because I can say that, yeah, that so, and let me back up a little bit because this is going to blow your mind when I tell you this. Okay, back in that those older times during the polio vaccine, right? There was a guy named Albert Sabin. So there were two guys who made the polio vaccines. There was the inactivated polio vaccine, Jonas Salk, and then there was the oral polio vaccine with Albert Sabin. Albert Sabin teams up with a guy named MP Chumakov, who is like the top Stalinist bioweaponeer. He had tested bioweapons on the Muslims and Mongolians in the in the late 1930s, and he was involved in some of those tick weapons.
Hmm.
They were experimenting, but he teams up with Albert Sabin in the early 1950s to make the oral polio vaccine that would be given to many millions of Americans, and that was contaminated by SV40. Um, then you had Jonas Salk too. He was investigated by the FBI and found to have all of these communist affiliations, right? But a second investigation cleared him after they had deemed that he was a danger and a threat to national security. This other one comes in and clears him anyway. So he designed the inactivated polio vaccine. That one was also tainted by SV40, right? And so this guy, MP Chumakov, who was like he even met with Eric Traub on Insel Reams when the Soviet Union captured that lab. He was meeting with Eric Traub to discuss that whole immune tolerance thing. So after after he teams up with Sabin on that vaccine, his son Konstantin Chumakov, um, Albert Sabin vouches for him, gets him a job at NIH. He comes over here in the late 80s, right? I think he was at the National, yeah, he was at NIH or NIAID, which is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. But eventually he gets a job at the FDA. And then he's running vaccine safety and review at the FDA. And then he approved the COVID vaccine.
Hmm.
So that's because that's one guy that I talked about a lot in my book, MP Chumakov. And I talked about how his son was involved in um he approved the COVID vaccine. But yeah, so that spike protein causes immune tolerance. That spike protein will destroy your immune system. And they even knew this. And so the crazy part is that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was funding research with NIH in 2012 called called disease tolerance as a defense strategy. They were trying to use this immune tolerance as a defense strategy. Like the whole idea is, well, if we suppress the immune system, it won't be able to have it won't have that fatal reaction to disease, right?
Yes.
But
Wow.
in but any kind of band-aid effect you have doing that is then followed by a cascade of chronic disease. It's what I call the dark triad of immune tolerance: chronic disease, neurological slash neuropsychiatric disorders, and cancers.
Hmm.
So under the idea of we need to protect ourselves against this threat, you're gonna basically destroy the immune systems of the entire country. Then you're gonna have this cascade of health problems. Like it makes absolutely no sense to do that because you're basically destroying the country long term. You're destroying the immune system, and and even if they do it, they still didn't prepare for the coming cascade of disease, right?
Mm.
So what I kind of talk, because I covered all that polio stuff in the back of, on the last chapter of my book, and I basically ended the book by saying that it seems that a a a hidden enemy has hijacked our public health system and is now using it to our detriment. Now you have these like NGOs. This would be consistent with this long-term takeover of America by an enemy, right? That's kind of the overall idea that I put forward at the end of the book.
Yeah.
And it seems this is that takeover really just like uncloaking itself and really just going at us. And I even talked about in the middle of my book about how there was a book by this ex-KGB guy, Alexander Kuzminov, where he was talking about how we had this plan to take over and basically contaminate the drinking water, use vaccines against us and stuff. It's just very in line with that whole idea.
Yeah.
So that's what this seems to have been is a hostile takeover and I would point the fingers at Britain. Britain,
Yeah.
well, because you know, I talk about the Soviet Union, but like I was saying before, Britain's the mastermind of that. And if you go look at, there was another really great book that came out recently that we published called Two World Wars and Hitler. Talked about that whole the Milner Group and those secret societies in Britain that took over basically. Have you ever heard of Tragedy and Hope? That book,
Yeah.
Tragedy and Hope by Carol
Yeah.
Quigley. Well, that's kind of the idea is that they basically also set up that puppet government under the Soviet Union, and so they're kind of like the masterminds. And when I started out early in my book, I talked about how Britain was attacking us from the very beginning of our country. So
Yeah.
that's kind of like the overall idea here is that it's British intelligence.
When we first started, you also mentioned that a lot of these agendas stem from very esoteric ideologies. How would you link these biological weapons to occult influences?
So Chris Milligan, who owns Trine Day, right? He's the one who published my book. His dad was very high up in OSS, and which eventually became the CIA. Now, he sat down with Chris at one point when Chris was young and basically asked him how he thought the world really worked. And Chris told him, he just said, "No, I got some news for you." Basically, he was saying that these secret societies, right, were all behind a lot of the stuff that was going on. He said the Vietnam War was a sham. They were running a lose scenario. He says it's all these secret societies. He said communism's a sham. It's all a big game. It's all a big game to them.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the biological warfare stuff, yeah, I mean, if you go look back at like early primitive times, I mean, this kind of all goes, poisoning kind of falls under the umbrella of witchcraft back then. You know, like poisoning was part of the whole witchcraft in in ancient times,
Hmm.
right? And then you have also the idea. See, I personally believe that there's another race that was created before us that is kind of living in a parallel dimension to us. Some know it as the jinn,
Hmm.
some know it as the fairy folk, the wee folk. Basically every society has their version of it. Well, I think occultism and magic, so to speak, is basically how to befriend and use this race to your assistance, right?
I
That's kind
see.
of the idea behind magic. You have your own powers, your own internal latent powers, but you also have this race that is invisible. That's what
Hmm.
I believe. Um, and there's a lot of I've read because this is one area that I'm very knowledgeable about as well. I have been researching this stuff for years, but that was a lot of like early on. It was like the Druids, for example, was they would study for years trying to become a magician, and also they would gained the assistance of the elementals, which are yet another name for the same race.
Hmm.
And in the Middle East, they oftentimes will say how they often thought disease was one of the manifestations of jinn possession. And that there are some Sufi mystics who say that the jinn, because there's a whole legend of Iblis, or the Middle Eastern version of Satan, as being one of these creatures, one of the jinn, who became the avowed enemy of humankind and then sought to kind of wage war on the human race since the beginning of time. And some of the Sufi mystics say that they use viruses and pathogens to cause disease in humans. But Eric Traub, for example, when you're thinking about, so he had these experiments called what were it? Checkerboard experiments, where he's using these different, it's the whole Masonic symbolism.
Hmm.
Um, he would have black and white chickens, right? And he would be infecting them, and he had this whole thing called these checkerboard experiments, and it's just kind of interesting. I mean, maybe he had
Yeah.
nothing to do with the Freemasons, but I just kind of, after studying the occult for so long, I just kind of thought that was interesting. But
Yeah.
this was as far as esoteric, it's just one of those things that you know that was often a part of witchcraft and occultism, was poisoning, how to put someone under a spell, pretty much.
For the last few minutes, I'd love to get your thoughts on where we're at now, especially with the Epstein revelations and everything that has unfolded since the COVID operation. Do you have hope? Do you think that there will ever be justice served to those at the highest levels?
I mean, I would love to see that happen, but I don't know. I mean, I had just put out an article about Epstein. Um, it was called Jeffrey Epstein, Black Budget Biosecurity, Biowarfare, and the Compromise of American Public Health. So there were so many things in those emails that I was able to find, that I was able to
Mm.
make an entire article about him and show all of these. They're talking about, he was talking with Bill Gates' advisor, Boris Nikolic, about synthetic viruses. And I have a Substack, right, where I put this out, and I'll talk about where you can find that in a minute. But yeah, I try to be optimistic, and I usually am when I can, but it's hard to be, just because it just seems like, I don't know, it just seems like this is such almost an immovable slab of just corruption, and it's like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
it's hard to be optimistic, but I guess in one sense I am kind of surprised that they released all of these Epstein files,
Yeah. Well, I
because
guess only time will tell with all this
right.
stuff, man. Well, this was fantastic information. Before I let you go, let everyone know how they can find out more about you, get your book, all your content, etc.
Yeah. I would say you could get the book at tryandday.com, or you can get it at amazon.com. I have the audio book available at my website called thesleeperagent.com. And I also have a Substack, which is at AW Finnegan, Finnegan. And I also have a YouTube at AW Finnegan. I am also I also have a X account under that same handle at AW Finnegan, and that's where you can find all of this information that I'm putting out. The Substack, that Jeffrey Epstein article did very well. A lot of people are reading that. I have a lot of interaction on that, so that's where you want to check it out. And there's also that article that I did about showing how that all those attempts to blame Lyme disease as something that's been around for thousands of years is totally bogus. It's just, so I have a lot of good articles up there you want to check out on my Substack. That's one place that you can keep track of me.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much. I'd definitely love to talk more in the future. There's a lot more we can get to. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We will talk again tomorrow. Hello friends, I am so excited to tell you about Independent Media Token. Independent Media Token is a brand new way to show your support for independent media without having to donate a dime. Independent Media Token is a cryptocurrency on the Solana blockchain designed to generate funds to promote and foster the growth of independent content creators, allowing them to engage in their art without having to worry about being demonetized. Through a network of media partners, of which you yourself can become a part of, Independent Media Token's goal is to ensure the powers that be can never cut off all of our areas of funding and censor the only free voices left in the world. Join the movement today. You can pick up Independent Media Token using Phantom Wallet or the Solana wallet of your choice, where you can easily swap your Solana for IMT. Grab some IMT today and remember to always know your team. To learn more, visit independentmediatoken.com or use the link right in the description. If you're looking to start your therapeutic microdosing journey, but don't know where to start, especially when looking for the highest quality ingredients, including nootropics, and what you'd expect from a true microdose capsule, check out our friends at Brainsupreme. They offer the absolute highest quality ingredients so you can start your microdosing journey knowing that you're getting top-notch ingredients. To find out more, visit their website using that link right in the description, and you can get 15% off your entire order. Are you and your family prepared for an emergency? Maybe the fake alien invasion? Now is the time to prepare yourself and your family for any event. Check out Prep Starts Now. Their mission is to provide high-quality preparedness products that empower individuals and families to be ready for any situation. They're committed to delivering reliable, trusted gear to ensure your safety, security, and peace of mind in times of need. Their product selection is carefully curated to provide you with the essential gear you need to stay prepared. From emergency kits to tactical tools, every item is chosen for its reliability and practicality. Prep Starts Now understands the importance of family, and their goal is to equip you with everything you need to build a solid plan for your family's preparedness. In today's ever-changing world, being prepared is more important than ever, and Prep Starts Now is here to help you and your family stay ready with quality products and practical guidance. Use the link in the description and get 15% off your order. You can now stream the forbidden documentary Occult Louisiana free on Tubi TV.